and also a homicide suspect that we have in custody as of this weekend as well. The first case was a case that captured the attention of our community, created a lot of fear within our community, and quite frankly generated a lot of work for our detectives as well as the Sheriff's Department. On September 1st, just before 8 p.m., the Sheriff's Department received a 911 call to a residence in Carruthers regarding a female who had showed up at a residence there, had made contact with the reporting party, and according to that reporting party who spoke to dispatchers, said that a female was at the door and that she was partially bound and gagged. The deputies, upon interviewing her, learned that she, according to the victim, had been kidnapped and robbed in the city of Fresno. She had also received an injury to her head, and she was transported by the deputies to CRMC, where our detectives responded and met with the victim. The victim in this case is Maria Gonzalez. She also goes by the last name of Silvestre. The victim told our detectives that at about 2:20 p.m. she was in the area of Floridora and 8th, driving her vehicle eastbound, when she stopped in the roadway for two dogs that had crossed the roadway. Upon doing so, suddenly two African-American males, both of them with masks on, covering their face, one of them armed with a handgun, got in the back seat of that vehicle and pointed the handgun at her and told her to drive. According to the victim, she then drove the vehicle away from the area, was frightened for her life, and she at that point continued to drive what she described as for approximately 2 hours in the Fresno area. At one point she did pull over at their direction, and one of the suspects in the back seat got into the driver's seat and placed her into the back seat, and he began to drive the vehicle. According to Gonzalez, the victim, a short time later, she woke up in the back seat of the vehicle. No suspects were present, and she had her hands tied behind her back with some type of a cord, a telephone cord, and also had a rag in her mouth and had been gagged. She said she felt a bump on the side of her head, knew that she had been what she thought to be struck or beaten by the suspects, and also, according to the victim, she felt she had been sexually assaulted by the suspects as a result of having what she described as moisture in her underwear. The victim at times, when she was at the hospital, would cry. At times appeared to be credible. And then at times there were certain things that were said that caused detectives to believe that perhaps she was not credible. The victim also stated that she had $9,000 in cash that was in her purse that she discovered missing. That $9,000 was intended to be taken to and paid to two subcontractors. These subcontractors are truck drivers who drive for her company. And she was supposed to meet both of those truck drivers in the area of Jensen and 99. According to her, that's where she was en route to when the two African-American males got into her vehicle. The trucking company is M&C Gonzalez Trucking Business, and it actually belongs to her, both her and her father. Although in interviewing the father said that he has pretty much relinquished control of the business to his daughter, and that she runs the day-to-day operations. The vehicle was processed by the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and we had at times 6 different detectives working this case tirelessly throughout Saturday and Sunday, downloading video, canvassing the neighborhoods, interviewing individuals as well as the victim. Detective McFarland to my left and Detective Sergeant James Fowler from the Street Violence Bureau, both of them had an opportunity to sit down with the victim yesterday evening and interviewed the the alleged victim for about 2.5 hours. And it was during that 2.5 hours that our detectives pointed out several different discrepancies to her regarding her story, and also shared with her potential video that would cause her to eventually tell the truth. And the truth is that Maria Gonzalez made up this entire story for the purpose of letting someone know that $9,000 had been stolen from her. $9,000 that she was supposed to pay to subcontractors. The reality is she did not have the $9,000 to pay the subcontractors, and that's why she made up the entire story. That story included tying herself up with her hands behind her back with a white cord and also placing a rag in her mouth. Again, she admitted to owing the subcontractors $9,000, but simply stated she did not have the money to pay them. So, 32-year-old Maria Gonzalez was released last night. However, our detectives are seeking a arrest warrant for her, and Ms. Gonzalez will be arrested for filing a false police report with the city of Fresno, and again, we'll be seeking an arrest warrant for her in the very near future. And with that, open up to any questions you might have.
It's got to be frustrating to have somebody pull your resources like that, but it's also something that you can't just take lightly either.
Yeah. Once this information came in, there were some things that obviously caused detectives and officers to believe that, in fact, this did happen. When these types of cases happen in any community, they are random. They create an enormous amount of fear. And based on everything the victim said, we had 2 suspects that were outstanding, armed, and had committed a random act of kidnapping and robbery. It is important for our detectives to do everything that they could at that time to try to get to the truth of the matter and to arrest those individuals responsible. And again, create a lot of fear. And so the fact that they were able to, in a relatively short period of time, get to the truth and determine that she had made up the entire story is a credit to our detectives.
At what point did the detectives realize things were not adding up with her?
There were a number of things that caused our detectives to realize that, in fact, this did not occur. Number one, the purse was left in the vehicle, but the money was taken. There were other items in her purse that could have been stolen if this was truly going to be a robbery. The manner in which she provided some of the details, she gave extreme details in terms of how she was able to get out of the back seat, how she was able to unlock the door, how she was able to get out of the cord. All of those things she gave in detail, but then there were a lot of other things that she just either didn't have recollection or was unable to provide. Generally, if a victim is able to provide detail in one area, they're able to provide detail throughout. That was not the case. There was also the fact that there was only one set of footprints located out there near the vehicle. And those one set of footprints belonged to the victim. There could have been other reasons for the other prints not being there, but that was highly unlikely. And obviously that gave the detectives the information that they needed. And the simple fact is, when they shared with the victim that there was video all up and along that corridor, that's when she said she made the entire story up solely for the purpose of not having the $9,000 to be able to pay the subcontractors. And for whatever reason, she decided this was the best way to get out of paying that debt. And it is a story that is ultimately going to cause her to be arrested. Unfortunately, it is a misdemeanor, but we'll be working with the district attorney's office to ensure that once this arrest is made, that that we're doing everything we can to hold this person accountable. It is important that when people file a false police report, especially of this magnitude, that we hold them accountable for doing so. Not only did this create an enormous amount of work and pull our detectives off of other cases that they could have been working or should have been working, but it created a lot of fear in our community. And for that, this individual has to be held accountable.
Did she say anything about why she described the suspect as being African American?
She did not get into the details of why she chose to identify these individuals as African American or any type of clothing description. But the fact is, she said that there was 2 African Americans, both of them with masks on their faces, and that one of them was armed with a handgun. Gave some very good detail in terms of how that occurred, how they got in the back seat, why she had stopped in the middle of the roadway. And the fact is, until we were able to put all of the pieces together, some of her story made sense, but a lot of the story did not.
Chief, any idea how long, did she say how long she'd been planning this out? Because she had some of the equipment, for lack of better terms, or props?
She did not get into the details of a lot of the planning, although we knew that, obviously she just didn't make the story up right then. Obviously she knew she did not have the $9,000. She owed somebody the money, and she had to come up with a believable, credible story that would allow her to get out of that debt. And this was the story she came up with. So, okay. And the second story I want to get into, and this is going to be very, very brief, is a homicide that occurred on August 19th at approximately 3 p.m. And that homicide was initially, the call was into our dispatch center to check the welfare of a male who was lying in front of a couple of businesses, actually lying between the King's Smoke Shop and Metro PCS, and that was at 3614 East Belmont, again on August 19th at 3 p.m. The officers arrived at that location and located a 38-year-old victim by the name of Miguel Arnulfo Garcia. He was lying in between these 2 businesses. He was bleeding profusely, and officers provided CPR and then transported him to CRMC. Again, he was pronounced deceased at that location. Doctors determined that he had a stab wound that had penetrated the heart. There were no witnesses at the scene. Detectives did an incredible job of canvassing the neighborhood, trying to locate anyone that had information regarding this case, locating businesses to see if they had any helpful video, and also checking a video policing camera that was nearby. And that did provide the information that we needed. It was that video that ultimately allowed our detectives to identify witnesses in the area that we were able to then interview, as well as a vehicle that was seen leaving the area. That vehicle ultimately was the suspect vehicle. And through, again, some good investigative work, they were able to determine the license plate of that vehicle, and as well as the person who was driving that vehicle. And that led investigators to the identification of 46-year-old Michael Leyva of Fresno, and he was identified a few days prior to August 29th. What our investigators determined was that Leyva had went to the business. He was involved in a disturbance with Garcia, the victim. So suspect Leyva and victim Garcia were involved in a disturbance, and that was right in front of Metro PCS. That verbal argument turned physical, and at that time, that's when Leyva pulled out a knife and stabbed victim Garcia one time in the chest. The vehicle, or Leyva, then got into the vehicle and fled the area. The vehicle was recovered, suspect vehicle was recovered on September 28th, and detectives also served a search warrant at a residence where Leyva was staying in central Fresno, recovered several knives. We're hoping that one of those knives ultimately is determined to be the murder weapon. Our detectives began working very, very closely with Leyva's girlfriend, who was very cooperative in this case. We want to thank her for that cooperation, because it was ultimately that cooperation with our homicide detectives that allowed us to locate Leyva. And so on Saturday, our detectives were led to a Motel 6 in the northwest Fresno area. Again, that information was provided by Leyva's girlfriend. Detectives made contact with Leyva, who was inside of a motel room, and ultimately he came outside with his hands up and surrendered to the detectives. That was 6 p.m. on Saturday, September 1st. Leyva has been booked into Fresno County Jail for murder. And what's interesting is that Leyva has a prior arrest and prior conviction. That prior conviction was for a case in 1991, and it too was for a stabbing where he murdered an individual. Ultimately, he pled to a manslaughter case, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Somehow he did not do the 11 years in prison, because 5 years later he was out in society and was being rearrested for other types of felony cases. So again, Leyva is being booked, or has been booked, into Fresno County Jail and charged with 1 count of murder. Any questions? Pretty straightforward case. Good work by our detectives. Homicide Detective Markey is the primary on that case. Okay. All righty. Thank you. Appreciate it.